Hello and what's up my friends, it's ThunderBob here, and tonight we are going to be taking a look at Warcraft II in the Warcraft Remastered collection. I have decided to revisit this entire series with the release of the Remastered collection. So far I've played through the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans, and have a full playthrough and a review on the channel. And now I've finished Warcraft II, and you can watch that playthrough, and now... What is up with that guy's eyes? That guy is really high. Okay, sorry, distracted. Yeah, I've got a playthrough on the channel of Warcraft II, and tonight we're going to be talking about my thoughts on that game. And just want to spend a few minutes giving you my perspective on the game. I played this back 20-some years ago, and I am enjoying my replay of it now in 2025. As I mentioned in the review for Warcraft Orcs and Humans, my first introduction to the Warcraft franchise was watching a friend play through the PlayStation version of Warcraft II. It was not until several years later, I would say late 99, early 2000, I got a PC of my own and I played through the Battle.net edition of Warcraft II. This was shortly after beating StarCraft and Brood Wars. And I do think that each game has improved the formula. And going backwards is kind of difficult because each game, each subsequent release has incrementally improved the formula and the genre has moved forward, and it can be difficult to go to those early games. Like Warcraft Orcs and Humans is very hard to recommend. I think Warcraft II had enough quality of life improvements and is much more playable than that original Warcraft Orcs and Humans, even in the Remastered collection. So I think this is a pretty good starting off point. We're going to be talking through this. So I've played Warcraft I and then II in direct succession, and it's made me realize that both of these games share a lot more DNA than I remember. While Warcraft II refined things in a lot of ways, the missions are structured in nearly identical ways. You start a mission with one or two simple objectives, there's very few surprises or story elements inside the mission. The way the races are mirrored is very similar between Warcraft I and Warcraft II, with just a couple of spells being different between some of the units. Also, both games have very terrible AI, and it's a major factor. Most missions it feels like you win not necessarily through strategy, but by exploiting soft spots in the enemy programming. So let's talk about what has changed in the remaster. While the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans Remastered included a ton of quality life gameplay tweaks, most of those were already present in the original release or the Battle.net 2 edition of Warcraft II, and this remaster is mostly a graphical enhancement. There are a few minor quality life enhancements like UI improvements, you get better tooltips, you can add health bars above units, you can have a slightly larger unit selection, but beyond that, this is very much that game from 25 years ago. Now, the graphical improvements are mostly adequate. I'd say some of the units look better than others. The claim here is this is all new art, but some of these units look like an AI upscale, while others look like new hand-drawn art. It's kind of a mixed bag overall. I do prefer the new graphics to the old at this point, but I don't think it's perfect. The increased resolution is a nice addition as well, but there is no ultra-wide support. I've also run into a few technical issues with crashes or long loading times, which seems really odd for such kind of an archaic looking game. I wish they would have gone a little bit harder on the gameplay improvements. You know, like shift-click commands, rally points, and the AI is probably the biggest offender. Speaking about the AI, at times the pathfinding actually feels worse here than Warcraft Orcs and Humans. Units just constantly get stuck going from one point of the map to another, unless you babysit them along the way. I also feel that a few of the missions could have used some tweaks. There are a couple of Orc missions here that are just nearly impossible, even having played it a few times and knowing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. An example of this is the Tomb of Sargeras. This is a mission that requires you to build a navy, except the enemy is already established and constantly sends larger naval armies to destroy your boats. The only solution I found was to exploit the bad AI and use catapults, pulling enemy boats into range, but far enough that the catapults could hit them. The AI was so bad that they would just sit there taking shot after shot from my catapults. Now let's talk about the story. Overall, the story in Warcraft 2 is better than Warcraft Orcs and Humans, but it really feels like Blizzard was still figuring out how to tell a story within the real-time strategy framework. There's a good intro video and a few short video clips between missions, and otherwise the story is told with a few sentences introducing each mission. Again, a few familiar names and locations are mentioned, but the game really does not flesh out any character or faction, or give anyone really any personality. The majority of the story in these earlier games came from reading the awesome manuals and using your imagination. It really feels like the game directly after this, StarCraft, is what led the revolution in storytelling in real-time strategy games. You had those mission introductions that had multiple speakers, you had actual named characters, you had story moments within the missions, you had really, really good intros and endings to the games, and I think this game was just a little bit too early to get all those story elements. It's not to say that the story is bad, there just really isn't enough storytelling within the game, and you really can't identify with any of the characters or factions. Now let's talk about unit and balance. There are a few new units versus Warcraft Orcs and Humans. You've got upgrades for the Knight and the Ogre to the Paladin and Ogre Magi, but it's largely just giving them skills from the Cleric and Necrolite. The game added in the Demolition Squad and Goblin Sappers, which give you some new options to blow up buildings or units. Both sides also get an air unit for surveying the battlefield, namely the Gnomish Flying Machine and the Goblin Zeppelin. And there are two offensive units, air units, the Griffin Rider and the Dragon. These flying units can be kind of frustrating to control as they do damage each other and your other units, and they also seem to have a delay between action, and it's very difficult to move about a dozen of these flying units around without hurting your other flying units. And the last addition to the game is the naval units, which is an oil tanker, a transport. You've got 2 warships and a submersible, which are basically mirrored on both sides. And just like Warcraft Orcs and Humans, both sides here are nearly identical, with just a few spells differentiating the two sides. The later Blizzard RTS games introduced more unique aspects to each race, and an almost rock, paper, scissors-like combat system that helped add more strategic depth and options to the game. StarCraft II had 3 very, very unique both gameplay and visual races, and then Warcraft III added 4 completely unique races. Comparing this to those games, these races play nearly identically. I do think base building has been much improved in Warcraft 2 from previous games. Roads are no longer required between your buildings, which allows for a lot more player freedom with your base design. The game also introduced defensive structures, towers, that allow you to defend your base, and can also be used offensively with the removal of the road requirement. You can build town halls now that allow your base to be expanded, and many of the missions require you to take multiple bases to succeed. Really, the cost of nearly every building, unit, and upgrade feels a lot more thought out here, and it gives you a lot less downtime where you're just watching for your gold to pile up to pay that 3,000 gold for an upgrade. The gold mines are also put in more logical places near your starting point and strategically across the map. Just overall, building, organizing, like moving units within your base, it all just feels a lot smoother than Warcraft Orcs and Humans. Alright, let's discuss combat. Overall, it's a lot smoother than in Warcraft Orcs and Humans. The units are more responsive, and micromanagement during combat is no longer a chore. Attack move is way more functional here, and you can babysit your units a lot less, except when you need to move them across the map. The time to kill most units feels longer, which gives you more time to micro and move your units. You can still win most missions by using catapults out of tower range and just pulling a few enemies to your army at a time. But new strategies like massing air units, using offensive towers, also work and gives you a lot more options. The new units fit into the existing framework well without making the older units feel redundant. I do think the game relies on naval units and battles a bit too much. While I don't mind the naval battles, I find the missions requiring you to use transports a bit tedious, and I prefer just a few of them sprinkled throughout the campaign. Instead, you get these over and over again in some portions of the campaign. And let's talk about the missions and the structure of the game. Just like my thoughts on Warcraft Orcs and Humans, I found the Orc faction much more difficult than the Human faction here. Not because of the unit composition this time, but rather because of how the missions are structured. Nearly every Orc mission has you constantly harassed by an aggressive opponent, with little time to build up an army or defenses between attacks. The majority of the Human missions, I found, you were rarely on the receiving end of these attacks. You just had time to build up a force and move across the map. It feels like some of these missions could have used a balance pass, and considering this game came out less than a year after Warcraft Orcs and Humans, I guess it's understandable that it's not perfect. While the missions are more complex than in Orcs and Humans, now having multiple objectives, and some of them a little bit more complex than in that first game, there's still very little surprise during the mission. You don't get much story element. Very rarely does something change from the outset of the mission to the end of the mission. That's not to say the missions are not fun. They're just largely simple compared to more modern real-time strategy games. So final thoughts here. In my review of Orcs and Humans, I said it was very hard to recommend this unless you have nostalgia or you want to see the history of the genre. I don't think the same is true here for Warcraft II. Most of the annoyances and archaic design choices of the original were fixed in Warcraft II, and it's a much more accessible game, and now the graphics have been improved as well. I still think Warcraft 3 is probably the most accessible starting point in my favorite game in the series. Most RTS players who are playing modern RTSs will probably have a better time starting at Warcraft 3, but if you want to see a more classic RTS style, Warcraft 2 is a valid game to play, and it's still enjoyable. I totally enjoyed my playthrough of this here, and can wholeheartedly recommend this to real-time strategy fans. So we're going to end the review here. I do want to thank you for watching. Next up, I'm going to be playing through Warcraft 3. I plan to have a full playthrough on the channel, and when I'm done, I'll do a review and give you my final thoughts on the Warcraft series. I'm actually considering maybe continuing on and playing StarCraft and StarCraft 2. May not be immediately after this, but sometime this year I do want to jump into that. So we'll end it there. If you get any thoughts, any comments, please drop a comment below. And thank you for watching. Just have a good night, everybody.